I brought two things because it's hard for me to decide sometimes. How's everybody doing? Yeah? Okay. So the first, I want to do two things this afternoon. First of all, I'm just a little housekeeping. Today is the last one, I guess, if we want to call it the academic year. I am scooting off in June and July, and I will work with Donna to put a date on the calendar for our resumption, God willing, inshallah, in August. I'm going to bring this over to Lou. So, me too. Okay. And I am also. Oh, I need 2 minutes. Okay. And I also am moving a little bit slowly because yesterday afternoon, for reasons passing understanding, I decided to do a triathlon. So it wasn't a long triathlon, but a triathlon I think is by definition long. It was what did I do? It was about 400. Let's see, how do I do this? Read mode. There we go. It was about 400-meter open water swim in a local lake, and then I did an 11-mile bike ride, and then I did a 2-mile run. So I'm a little sore. I'm moving a little slowly today. Thank you. Yes. I was looking for pity, actually, not for applause. So I'm just kidding. All right, let's move into more important things. So I brought you two things today. One of them, I think, was reflected in the title that was sent out in the materials. The title was something like Israeli National Holidays, a new Jewish narrative. Okay. And what I meant by that title, what we're going to look at, what I've made a chart of here is a set of holidays that we are in the middle of and that do not cohere. They bang into each other. They don't make any sense. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say they don't make any sense, but they are really at cross purposes. And this is a very complicated time of year. So I'll begin by just one little anecdote. Those of you who saw me on Shabbat may have noticed that something changed, which is that I shaved my beard, okay? People pay too much attention to the rabbi's facial hair, okay? But from the second day of Passover, if you go to Jerusalem, the barbers are all very busy in the days leading up to Passover. When I spent the year in Jerusalem with my sons, part of what we did is we went off to the barber and sort of, we're there right before Passover. And the reason for that is that from the second day of Passover begins a period called Sfirat HaOmer. Right? Sfirat HaOmer means the counting of the Omer. It's actually mentioned in the Bible. There are biblical verses that refer to this, that there is a commandment to count from the language is actually the Shabbat after Passover. The rabbis understood Shabbat to be the Shabbat was a festival day, so it's the second festival day. But basically from the second day of Passover until Shavuot, to count 7 weeks. So 7 times 7, 49 days. And then the 50th day, and I believe that it is the same thing that is what in Christianity became Pentecost. That's the word 50, right? And in Judaism is what's called Shavuot, a holiday. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. The word Shavuot means weeks because you've counted 7 weeks. Well, in rabbinic times, there was a terrible plague that afflicted and killed 20,000 of Rabbi Akiva's students during this period. And the plague came to an end, according to legend, on the 33rd day of the Omer, what in Jewish tradition is Lag BaOmer. Lag is Lamed, which is the number 30 in Gematria in sort of the counting system, and Gimel is 33. And so it was a period of semi-mourning for the Jewish people, and there grew the custom of one of the things that mourners do is they refrain from getting haircuts and from shaving. And so I have the custom of getting a haircut before Passover and of not shaving for the first part of the Omer. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Some people, so there's now another set of holidays, and I'm going to talk more about this, but there's another set of holidays that celebrates the state of Israel. And so for a long time, because of the state of Israel, it's a different moment in Jewish history. I've had the habit of stopping my my lack of shaving on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. But there's also one more tradition out there, which is today and yesterday was what's called Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is a new month, and a new month is a semi-festival in Judaism. And so I shaved for two reasons. Number one, because it's Rosh Chodesh, and also because it's Rosh Chodesh, the other thing is you're not supposed to plan weddings during the counting of this period of the Omer. But there's a couple that came to me many months ago and said, we'd like you to do a wedding, and we picked Rosh Chodesh of ER. We picked this Rosh Chodesh. Would that work for you? And I said, yeah, like the counting of the Omer things are not that rigid. And it's a month, right? It's the new month, which is a semi-festival, appropriate to get married. So in honor of the bride and groom, I'm doing a wedding later today. So I shaved for the wedding. Anyways, let me backtrack and tell you about these two. But it's a very complicated time of year. Okay. Donna, yeah.
Letting your hair grow, not shaving? I mean, are you breaking some kind of a halachic thing like that?
So I would say some people who are very, very stringent about the Omer, right, would say, no, you shaved too early, right? You have to wait until Lag BaOmer. But it's all how you understand this period of mourning. And the traditions around Sfirat Omer are not so stringent, right? They're at best rabbinic and probably more customs than law. But of course, Donna, we're Jews, and so somewhere there is somebody who would say, Rabbi, you're wrong. You should do it differently, right? Because lest we agree on anything, God forbid. All right, so it's a very complicated time of year, and the reason is that there's two narratives that I want to point out to you, and I put them on a chart here. On the left-hand side, I've labeled each of these narratives as a holiday cycle. Okay, in the traditional Jewish holiday cycle, and when I say that, what I mean is this is something that I would say, 99, probably 100% of religious Jews were doing all around the world, right, for 100 years ago, or maybe 150 years ago, okay, and had been doing this set of holidays this way for several thousand years, right, until the beginning of the rabbinic period, right, is in 200 or 300 CE. Okay, what was everybody doing? Well, we all celebrated Passover. Okay, thank you. I just wanted some ice. That's so sweet of you. Thank you very much. So all celebrating Passover. Okay, and we all know, and we'll talk about the holiday of Passover, but after Passover, I just told you that there's a period of counting the Omer, And that counting of the Omer connects to the holiday of Shavuot. Okay, so you count 7 weeks and then you get to the holiday of Shavuot. In the Bible, actually, the holiday of Shavuot is a pilgrimage festival where you present the sheaf, a sheaf of grain. Okay, you wave a sheaf of grain, and it's kind of like the first fruits. You present the first fruits. But at a certain time, probably after the destruction of the temples, the rabbis are trying to remake holidays because you don't have a pilgrimage festival to go to anymore. The holiday of Shavuot becomes associated with the gift of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's a holiday that celebrates God's revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai to the Jewish people. All right. And so what you're doing is you're tracing the story from Passover, the counting of the Omer, from the Exodus from Egypt and the journey to Mount Sinai. Okay, and that's the holiday period. And as I said, there's this semi-mourning period in between. But even in the Bible, the holidays of Passover and Shavuot were connected. Okay, now what is the story that set of holidays tell? The setting begins in Egypt. Okay, the story begins in Egypt. Egypt is the place of our oppression. It is all of the Egyptians. The Bible tells us that all of the Egyptians were involved in various ways. At least the way that the rabbis read the story, but they're led by an oppressive figure whose name is Pharaoh. Okay, and the language I put here, the language of hatred. Pharaoh begins by saying, the Israelites have become too numerous, and so what we're going to do, we need to deal with that. And so we're going to set taskmasters over them. It's a very interesting response, right, to a fear of overpopulation is making the population build things, right? I think that maybe the idea being that they're going to be so tired from building all day that they're not going to have the energy to either engage in sexual relations or to raise children. That was the intent. It quickly becomes, that didn't work, and so we're going to we're going to have the Hebrew midwives kill the baby boys. That doesn't work, and so then it turns into throwing all baby boys into the river. Okay, and the aim of all of that, right? To be clear, and I'm using an anachronistic term, but the aim of all of that is genocide. Right? Genocide from the word side, which means to kill, and genus is a type or a species of people. Pharaoh looks at the people, and he is actually the first one to call the Israelites a people. Okay? Am B'nai Israel. He's the first one ever to use that term, referring to the Israelites as people. And his purpose in the building project and in the killing of the children on the birth stool and in the extermination of the baby boys is to, if not wipe out the entire Jewish people, certainly to wipe out a segment of the Jewish people, the males, so that the population cannot grow. So what happens in the story is that the Israelites are freed by virtue of the defeat of Pharaoh and the defeat of the Egyptians. The tool that is used for doing that are the plagues, right? God sends Moses and Aaron, and they deliver the plagues. And the chief actor in that story is God. Okay, to the extent that God actually says several times, I'm doing this so that my name will be known throughout the world. I'm doing this so that you will know, so that everybody will know that I'm God. And I actually don't want you to participate very much in this. Okay, put some blood on the door, right, the thing, so you don't get wiped out by this destroyer who I'm sending. But basically, your job is to it's to let me do my work, right? And what is the destination of that story? God says, right, I want to set you free so that you can worship me. It seems to be a little bit of a ruse because they're supposed to, they tell Pharaoh, we're just going to go worship God for 3 days in the wilderness. But, but the purpose of freedom is to go and worship God in the wilderness. And the culmination of the story, it really ends on Shavuot with the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai and fulfilling the goal described in the story of you're going to go and serve God in the wilderness. Okay. And now, by the way, the content of what's revealed at Mount Sinai is here are the laws, and I want you to go and to live those laws in the land of Israel, right? And so there's a second destination, which is to live out the laws in the land of Israel. But the Torah ends its narrative in terms of a holiday cycle. We end at Mount Sinai, okay? And the Torah ends with us always just about to enter the land, right? It's not until the book of Joshua that the people enter the land. The Torah ends with us just about to enter the land. And the holiday cycle, again, the story that's being told by the celebration of these holidays is you were slaves, God brought the plagues and freed you, and the happy ever after is that you received the Torah at Mount Sinai and you're serving God, okay? And so there's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end to this holiday arc. Judy? Great. Yes. So Judy's question for those listening online is, isn't there a disconnect between the mourning period of the Omer and this joyous time of Passover? And the answer is yes, there is, right? No, I mean, so I think what it shows you is that the challenge that I'm about to lay out in terms of the Israeli holidays is not, it is a different challenge in content, but it's not a different qualitative challenge. The rabbis were always doing this, right? And what's this? They were struggling with how do we incorporate the memory of events which happen to us into the calendar into our mythic calendar. And so they confronted, I told you this thing, and just so we understand the dates here, the Exodus, we're talking about, 1400 BCE, and the death of Rabbi Akiva's students, we're talking about as happening in the 2nd century. Okay, so you're talking about a span 1,500 years later, there is this great historical event, which is that there's a death of a bunch of these students. It happens around the time of Passover. And so they're faced with this question of, but we can't just not remember that. And so we're futzing with things, right? Yes, it's a happy time, right? The rabbis will say in other places, the joy of Passover is supposed to spread out for the entire month of Nisan, okay? And so the whole idea that you're mourning at all during Nisan doesn't make any sense. And yet they have this, and yet they need to remember this period. And so they do, okay? So what I want to show you is that phenomenon is now going to repeat itself with the Israeli national holidays. So there's a second set of holidays that we are right in the middle of, okay? Yom and the holiday the cycle is being celebrated, commemorated, certainly in the state of Israel and by, I would say, most Jews around the world. It begins with Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah was, I think it was Mondays. It began Sunday night, Monday. Shoah is the English word, is the Hebrew word for catastrophe. It is the way in which certainly and many Jews around the world refer to the events of the Holocaust. The word Holocaust carries with it problematic connotations because it means a burnt offering. And the idea that Jews in the who died at the hands of the Nazis were an offering of some sort is obviously problematic. And so the Hebrew word that's used is shoah, which just means catastrophe. I'll say more about the name of Yom HaShoah in a few minutes, but 7 days later, and so I believe this year it's Sunday night, Monday, Israel will celebrate a second holiday called Yom HaZikaron. Yom HaZikaron is Israel's Memorial Day. I want to say that the holiday, I think, has a different impact on the country than America's Memorial Day does, which I think is unfortunate in terms of the American experience. But it's also a blessing. What do I mean by that? It's a blessing because far, far, far fewer Americans have been affected personally by the death of soldiers and people who have died in terrorism in the United States than is the case in Israel, right? So that's a blessing. I think it's a problem, and because I think that Americans sometimes lose sight of the debt that we owe to those soldiers who have died that secure our freedom, and we sometimes don't pay as much attention to that as we ought to. And in Israel, Memorial Day is a deeply emotional day because there is virtually no, I would say nobody, particularly nobody in the Jewish community, but many, many Druze, many Arab Israelis as well, have been affected and know people personally who died either in army service or in acts of terrorism. And so there are ceremonies around the country, and those of you who have been there will know what I'm talking about. You can find this on YouTube. There's a tremendously powerful moment where in the evening, this happens on Yom HaShoah as well, but in the evening and then in the morning, there is a siren which plays all over Israel. You can see footage on the main highways. Cars slow down and stop, and people get out of their cars and stand at attention. Busy, trafficy streets stop. Everybody stops and virtually everybody stops and stands at attention. And there are songs of mourning and sadness which are played on the radio. There are all news stories, etc., but not just sort of something at the end of the news, of the nightly 5-minute segment that they have on in the national news. This is something where all day, right? All day there are stories, intimate stories about people and their families. And then the very next day, and it's a very, very strange period, Israel transitions from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut. Yom HaAtzmaut is Israel's Independence Day. And so there are these extraordinary ceremonies where you move from mourning to celebration. There are festivities. There is what's called the Mangal, which is the Israeli national grill. I mean, it's not an official thing, but basically people have these little portable grills that they, got from China somewhere, made with very cheap materials. Everybody takes some charcoal, puts a lot of lighter fluid on it, leaves it for 10 minutes, and then lights it up. And then there's meat, and more meat, chicken, this, that, every once in a while you'll see a vegetarian kebab, right? But the whole country is just sort of grilling and celebrating, and there's this tremendous celebration. And that set of holidays is telling a story, okay? And it's a similar and different story to the traditional Jewish story. First of all, it begins with Yom HaShoah. The setting of that story is Nazi Europe. And the origin, the fuller name of Yom HaShoah is Yom Zichron HaShoah v'Hagvura, which means there's nothing about this on future pages, right? That's like part 2 of today. It's the day of remembering the Shoah and bravery. Givura, bravery. Which is a very, and why is it named that? Because originally the day was going to be set, if you can imagine this, basically on Erev Pesach, right? On the day before Pesach. Why, which, that, if you want to talk about a collision of calendars, right? Why would you have Yom HaShoah on Erev Pesach? Because it is remembering not just the Shoah, but the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto made a decision to rebel against the Nazis, to begin their uprising on Pesach. Because for 2 reasons. Number one, the Nazis would use Jewish holidays as special days of either shootings or deportations and other things like that, and also because there is a lot built into the celebration of Pesach that this is a day not just for redemption back then, but for the redemption of the Jewish people. And the hope was that they would be sort of somehow mustering bigger forces in the universe to help their uprising succeed. This was suggested, it was quickly rejected, right? Basically, people said, you can't do that, right? Like, you can't have, and by the way, who is setting, right, Yom HaShoah? It is not the chief rabbinate, okay? It's not a religious body, it's the Knesset. Israel's parliament, right, is now legislating a national holiday. But they say we can't do it on Pesach. And so it ends up getting fixed around the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but also 7 days before Yom HaZikaron, right? And it gets, basically plugged into this calendar to say this is related to Memorial Day and Independence Day. Who is the oppressive figure? I didn't even write his name, right? Hitler, Yimach Shemo, may his name be erased, is sort of the correlative figure to Pharaoh. The language of hatred, I'll just remind you that the particular type of anti-Semitism that takes place during the Shoah, anti-Semitism for a long time is Christian anti-Semitism, and there's a remedy for that, which is that Jews can convert to Christianity, and you do have many times in Jewish history where, there's forced conversion, but the anti-Semitism manifests itself in a number of ways. But it's basically saying there's a new covenant, and the continued existence of the Jewish people, in an oppressed state, sort of testifies to the fact that the old covenant is exhausted, and you should become Christian, right? You should become Christian, and And that's sort of seen as there is, my point is that there's a remedy there. Whereas what happens in the late 19th century is that racial theories begin to be developed, and Hitler's anti-Semitism is an anti-Semitism of racial impurity, that Jews are understood to have a gene, certain type of blood, a certain type of gene, and that the only way in which Jews and Judaism can be removed from the world, Jews cannot convert away from themselves because it is fundamental to their genes, and therefore that ultimately leads to the final solution, right? Hitler at various points actually contemplates other solutions, which is, and you've heard me talk about this before, which is emigration. The doors of the world are locked to Jews, and Hitler eventually comes, if nobody's going to take the Jews, then we're going to murder them all. Okay, that's the language of hatred. Let me just finish the chart. And the tool for overturning the oppression, okay, here I want to say is in this story, what we remember is Yom HaZikaron, which is Memorial Day, and that is Jewish soldiers taking up arms and fighting, yes, against the Nazis. There were actually Jews who lived in British Mandate Palestine who joined in the fight of the Allied forces against the Nazis, but ends up being a fight against the British and a fight against the local Arab, not just the local Arabs, but all of the Arab countries who attack Israel when Israel declares independence. And we celebrate and honor the death of these people who created the state of Israel. And the final act in this is Yom HaAtzmaut, the creation of an independent state of Israel. That's the destination. And I'll just remind you that what is the purpose of that? If the purpose of the Exodus was that the Jewish people would go and serve God in the desert, the purpose of Zionism can be summarized in the Israeli national anthem, Lihiyot Am Chovshi Be'artzenu, which translates to be a free people in our land. What I want to point out to you is that does not say to be a free people so we can serve God in our land, right? And that God in this story has been replaced to some extent by, we are not waiting for plagues. We are taking up arms ourselves. And we are not, our job, just to finish up the chart, is not to be passive and let God redeem us. It is to be active players in history. Okay, and the question of, which narrative speaks to us and which narrative, I titled this, a new Jewish national narrative ? Right? Because the question of, now I don't think you have to choose one or the other, but these are different narratives carrying different celebrations of different things, right? One of them is a purely religious narrative where God is at the center. One is a more secular narrative where God is very much not at the center. And the differences between being a free people to sort of do whatever we want in Israel versus serving God in the land of Israel by obeying the laws that are given to us at Mount Sinai, right? Those are two different visions, right, for what Israel and who the Jews are supposed to be. And what I want to finish this section of the talk today just by saying, Judaism is always at a crossroads, okay? But we are living at a crossroads in history, right? This is a tremendously different set of questions than the Jewish people was facing 500 years ago. than the Jewish people was facing 200 years ago. It is, I would say 300 years ago, we were facing questions about the intersection between Judaism and modernity, and questions about ways in which we do or don't assimilate into a nation state. This is a set of questions that is really 75 years old, right? It began, or maybe 100 years ago. It begins with Zionism. It begins with the founding of the Jewish state, and it's never been asked before. And we're right in the middle, right? I chose to do this because we just celebrated Passover. We just commemorated Yom HaShoah. We're counting the Omer. It's Rosh Chodesh, so I just shaved my beard. We're coming up on Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut, and then after that, we're heading to Shavuot, right, and Mount Sinai. And who knows where we're going, what we're doing, but that's all of the stuff that's swirling around us. Who had their hand up? Judy? Yeah.
It's true that Jews particularly converted in the medieval period. Jewish but those who did so often became subject, and therefore that was the idea of what I'm having a senior
Moran, the conversos or Moran, the Inquisition. That's right. That's right. So even though conversion, right? So there's a question as to whether, in the end, you were able to, as it were, become Christian, right, and sort of fully assimilate into Christian society. And you have the purpose of the Spanish Inquisition was, it was directed against Jews, but it was also directed against Jews who had converted, right, and who were understood to have not converted sufficiently, right? So I don't want to oversimplify it. So I appreciate that tweak to it. Questions, responses, thoughts before we move on with my second itinerary for today. Yeah, Natalie.
Or don't have to go out and there was big celebration.
Could be in Jerusalem, could be Tel Aviv.
Because they had the families of the victims to together in one week, and the brothers in the, and it was this holy honor.
Yes. Yeah. It's a very, very powerful experience. And I would say if you want to support one of our, if you want to support Israelis who are in the community, there will be a ceremony, I believe this Sunday night at the JCC. And, hasn't been an easy time to be an Israeli in general. But when Israelis are away from Israel at this time of year, it is particularly poignant, right? Because when you're in Israel, there's a lot of attention being paid to your grief. And in the United States, you're sort of walking around. For everybody else, it's a regular day. And for you, sort of finding a time, I think it's a very important thing that the JCC does in giving a setting for Israelis to gather together and to have a moment where that particular grief and loss is acknowledged. And we, in the community can support them in that way. Other reactions, thoughts, questions? I've stunned you into silence. Lou, go ahead. I want to say, if your last name is not Siegel, you are allowed to make a comment or ask a question.
the special thing in Israel has set aside that period and show, but many object to the idea. Many Americans have that Israel is formed as response to the show. Remember, Zionism precedes the show. Now, you can say the setting of oppression are the wrong, but it's more than that, and the result is the same.
Yeah, if I were to tweak, and I can do it here. I would put here the setting of the oppression could be, oops, whereas if I'm in read only mode, I can't do. Anyways, I'll correct it later. Right. So to be clear, I think it would be more accurate to say, maybe in this narrative, that the oppression peaks in the Shoah, but it is really, it begins with the Dreyfus trial. Okay, the Dreyfus trial proves Dreyfus is sort of he's a French soldier, right? He's a loyal patriot to the most accepting, progressive isn't the right word, enlightened society in Western Europe. All of the ideals of the Enlightenment, right, of modernity, are supposed to manifest themselves in France. And Dreyfus is the perfect French Jew. And when Herzl sees Dreyfus tried for and convicted for treason, he comes to the conclusion that, to the broad conclusion that the West will never, that the Enlightenment is not going to work for securing Jewish safety, right? The hope was that the Enlightenment would work for securing Jewish safety. American Jews are still counting on that, right? I think you can describe the Jewish world today in two ways. Essentially, there's the state of Israel, which has said, we are willing to be part of the world, but our condition on being part of the world is that we have our own country and our own army to protect ourselves when necessary. And then American Jews who have said, we are willing to be part of the world, and we believe that America is different. We believe that the experiment in American democracy is different. So Jews form different, even though, right, I would say, just moving from Dreyfus, right, most of the third set of Jews die in the Holocaust, right? There's a set of Jews who die in the Holocaust. The vast majority, and you should understand, the vast majority of Jews in Eastern Europe who didn't die in the Holocaust are here in America, right? And they stay in America, and we've stayed in America, right? Betting that America is different. And the other Jews in the world are the Zionists, who are actually begin as a very small percentage of the population from Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And they are saying, we don't trust the West, just fundamentally. We're not going to exit the world. We're not going to live in a ghetto. And we're also not going to assimilate away and let our Jewish identity disappear altogether. But these are our two big bets at the poker table, right, for how this is going to work. Yeah. And then Richard.
I know from two parts. The first is, how do you fit the Maccabee legend into the notion that this is unprecedented? The mention of requiring armed resistance, even if it's not going to be successful.
So the story of the Maccabees becomes let me answer you in two ways. In rabbinic Judaism, Hanukkah is played down as a holiday. Okay, it's big for us because Christians are celebrating Christmas and it falls out of time of Christmas. But for most of Jewish history, Hanukkah was a small holiday. In the Mishnah, which is the code of Jewish law that sort of defines the rabbinic period, There is a holiday for Purim, which is in the book of Esther. There's no holiday, there's no tractate describing the laws of Hanukkah. Okay, so rabbinically, the rabbis are deeply uncomfortable with Hanukkah because they don't want for Jews to rise up militarily because it has led to massacres, right? And so the rabbis are cultivating a culture which is more quietistic. The Zionists lift up. So I went to something called the Maccabee Games, okay, and they were called the Maccabee Games. The Maccabee Games are part of the Zionist movement, and the Maccabees were lifted up to valorize that story and to make it more central, right? Hanukkah, by the way, just is another example of, the book of Maccabees is not in the Jewish Bible, right? It's in the Apocrypha, and it's not seen as a holy book, right? And it is an interesting example where you have events in history become part of religious celebration. And there is a whole set of questions, which we're going to look at in a minute, about in what way should we or should we not celebrate these three holidays, or in general, the state of Israel religiously, right? So we have questions in our own synagogue about, should we say a prayer for the state of Israel? Should we not say a prayer for the state of Israel, right? What does it mean to pray for a secular nation state, right? What is the religious significance of what happened? And then coming up on this holiday, there's a whole set of questions of, should we say Hallel, right? Hallel is a set of festive celebratory prayers that's said religiously. And by the way, we say Hallel all 8 days of Hanukkah, right? And Hanukkah is a holiday that celebrates a historical moment, right? But wait a minute, how do you know? And the big question here is, how do you know when God has acted in history? How do you know, right? So we know that God acted in history because in the Exodus, because that's our story, that's our fundamental story, and it doesn't matter whether it was historically true or not. It happened, right? Because we celebrate that it happened, because that's our story, right? Archaeology be damned, right? It doesn't, right? Whoever heard of it, you say Hallel, right? But then later on, what you say Hallel over becomes confused. I have a whole other second set of things that I want to do. Let me take Richard.
First of all, we said next year in Jerusalem before Zionism, I assume.
Yes.
And also before Zionism, before the Israeli, before righteous, one person.
Yeah.
There were pogroms in Eastern Europe. Wasn't there already a Zionist movement in Eastern Europe before Herzl?
So certainly before Herzl, you have Zionists beginning. Zionism, and I'm not a scholar of Zionist history, so but you do have Zionist thinkers who were beginning before. I would say in the stew of nationalist thought, right, that's happening. In other words, the world is starting to the same forces that created America and that created France also created Zionism, right? A sense that that people should have freedom, and that freedom is best secured by by people through the forming of a nation, and the belief that people people have inalienable rights, and those can be secured. All of those things are sort of the stew in which Zionism is beginning to form. And essentially you have Jews who are going, yeah, why doesn't this make sense for us, right? And I would say that's probably the engine that's driving it, and also maybe that's the carrot, right? We deserve this. And then there's the stick, which is the pogroms and of Eastern Europe and the failure of really of it in Western Europe that climaxes with the Holocaust, with the Shoah. I think those are the things that ultimately create the state of Israel. But you're right that Zionism, it does precede Herzl, right? Herzl is Herzl actually up until that point is not a political Zionist. He's a cultural Zionist. There are different types of Zionists who have different visions for what are we trying to do in the land of Israel? Are we doing it in the land of Israel, or can it be anywhere? Right? These are all questions that are very active. Let's look at do you still have energy? Can we do another 15 minutes? Is that okay? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Do you have anywhere to be? What? I still have energy. I can never tell if we go noon to 1 or noon to 1:30. I thought it was 1:30, but I think everybody gets tired after certain. Anyway, so we'll see. Tell me to be quiet when the time comes. Okay. So what I copied for you here. I'm not being original. Okay. I had a great session with Yehuda Kurtzler, who is one of the presidents of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And he gave us a packet, and I'm sharing the packet with you. Okay, so don't think that I'm so smart. I just want to review some of the sources that he gave to us. So what the logic of these sources is as follows. What you have in front of you is a piece by Marie Sirkin. It's written in 1946, and it is a strong argument. So let me take a step back. What I want to do with this second part of our time together is to think about how do we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut this year? Hey, right? It's a hard year. Okay, there's a lot of very, very difficult stuff going on. And what the big picture that Yehuda gave to us that I want to give to you is that we can celebrate things even when they're not perfect. Okay, and actually, it's important to celebrate. It's actually really important to cultivate a celebration of, I don't want to call it mediocrity, right? A celebration of things that have been achieved. Okay. So Marie Sirkin in 1946 is writing about criticism that has come to the Jewish Agency, because the Jewish Agency has now accepted the possibility, the proposal of partition in the land of Israel. Okay. I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you, but when the Balfour Declaration is issued, it says the creation of a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine, I think is what it says. There's nothing which says that refers to Tel Aviv and sort of the western part of Israel. The hope and actually the understanding was that it applied to the whole West Bank and possibly even to the other side of the Jordan. Right? Please remember that the country of Jordan was also part of British Mandate Palestine. Right? There are people who throw out there, I don't think it's useful, but they throw out there this idea that if you want, the Palestinian state is in Jordan. Right. And what they're saying is, hey, look, right, this was all a land which was supposed to be divided up, that was controlled by the British, and it was supposed to be divided up. And there was a whole thing created called Jordan. Right. And there was supposed to be a Jewish homeland, and the Jewish homeland was supposed to be everything to the west of the Jordan. Okay. The Jewish Agency, I just want to read a little bit of her defense. So she starts out in the middle of the first paragraph. Parties are going on record in their official platforms as to whether they oppose or accept partition. Zionist leaders are committing themselves pro and con. In the present deadlock, the Jewish Agency has openly advanced the compromise formula of a viable Jewish state in an adequate portion of Palestine as a basis for discussion. In this formula, which has precipitated the familiar charges of treason and timidity raised by the ideological opponents of partition. So people are already starting to yell and scream, how can you give in? And the next paragraph basically says, look, it's not like we haven't been negotiating, okay? She finishes that paragraph by saying the situation of both the Yishuv and of the Jews of Europe is too grave to admit of a rhetorical maximalism which has no prospect of realization within the predictable future. Partition must have more to recommend it than hypothetical acceptability to the British. It has to offer Zionism definite immediate advantages for the losses we incur. In other words, this is not perfect, but there are benefits to this, which is that at this point, they understand what has happened in Europe. And they understand that the Jewish people need a place, and what is going to be accepted. She sort of goes through, let us suppose that partition had been accepted in 1937 and a Jewish state had been established in a part of Palestine. And it wasn't offered back then, right? But basically what she says is, we probably could have saved several million Jews, right? Because we would have had the right to bring all of these people into a small state. We can't blame ourselves for not having been seers. This is the next page. But if we may be forgiven for lacking foresight, we cannot afford to neglect the indications provided by hindsight. That too is a form of vision. We now know that a status in Palestine which will create possibilities for immediate immigration and which will offer Jewish independence is the primary need of the Jewish people. It might be sensible to seek to delay a final political solution if there were any likelihood that an interim period would provide for such immigration, but all evidence points to the contrary. And so she concludes that she's making a strong argument for the wisdom of compromise. Okay, and just to show you that other people feel differently, I'll give you Herzer brought a passage from Yehuda Mirsky, who writes about Rav Kook. And this is a story about Rav Kook. On the eve of Israel's 19th Independence Day in May 1967, amid the pre-war crisis, Tzvi Yehuda addressed his students and gave the speech of his life. He recalled the night of November 29th, 1947. What was that? It was approved, right? That was when the partition plan was approved in the United Nations, right? In Hebrew, in Jerusalem, there's a street, Kaftet b'November, 29th of November, in 1947. Israel declares independence in 1948. But the night of that, right, following the United Nations vote to partition Palestine, which gave the people a compromise, a state of their own with borders well short of those promised to the children of Israel in the Bible. As the masses thronged in celebration, he could not join in, right? Speaking of Rav Kook. Where is our Hebron? Are we forgetting it, right? Hebron was not included in the partition plan. Hebron is where Abraham buys a birthplace, a burial place for Sarah. It's where Jews lived continuously until the massacre in 1927, I believe, right? There were Jews living continuously in Hebron until 1927. But this partition plan is not going to give it back. And our Shechem and our Jericho, where is each and every and our East Bank, right? He's saying, hey, well, what about the East Bank? That was also promised in some of these borders. Where is each and every clod of earth, every last bit, every 4 cubits of the land of Israel? Can we forego even 1 millimeter of them? God forbid, shaken in all my body, all wounded in pieces, I couldn't then rejoice. So the whole Jewish people is rejoicing, and he's grieving. We sat shaken and silent. In the end, we recovered and said, "This is from God, to our eyes a wonder," right? Which is a quotation from Zeh. The state of Israel, he told his disciples, is to be sure far from perfect. Yet I say this is the state that the prophets foresaw, how to realize its redemptive potential at the fulfillment of the mitzvah of settling the land. And then several weeks later in the 6-day war, the heartlands of Judea and Samaria came under Israeli control, and Yehuda, it seemed, was a prophet. Now, he was a prophet, but the occupation of, and I use my language very carefully, the occupation of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, right, has not been redemption. It's been a nightmare and something from which the Jewish people and the Israeli people need to extricate ourselves. The point being is that you have approaches here of somebody who says we can't celebrate until we have everything, right? Versus the first approach, which is saying, let us be able to celebrate something which is good, even if it's not everything that we always dreamed. And he then brings a few sources that I think are worth reading. Rabbi Avira taught sometimes the name of Rav Ami, sometimes the name of Rav Asi, as follows. Here's a story from the Talmud. The ministering angels, you see where I am? Verse 3. I think it's the next page. The ministering angels said before the Holy One, Sovereign of the universe, is written in your Torah that you don't show partiality or take a bribe, yet you show partiality to Israel. As it is written, may God show partiality or favor to you. So you have a verse which says God is not partial, and then you have a verse which says God is partial to Israel. And God replied and said, what is it? Consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, right? That's basically, right? Like, what can I do? What can I do? I wrote in the Torah, okay, and there's a verse in Deuteronomy where God says, I want you to eat. You should eat. And so began, right, Jewish history. You should eat. You should be satisfied, and then you should bless. Okay? So if you then ask yourself the question, what's the logic of this? After you eat, right, how much do you have to eat in order to say a blessing? And the answer is, well, you have to be satisfied. And yet, what law do the rabbis make? The rabbis say that even if you've only eaten an olive's worth of food, you still have to bless. Right? So God is basically, first of all, God is saying, that's so nice. They want to say thank you to me, even with just a little bit of food. And the rabbis are poking fun at themselves because nobody is satisfied when you have just an olive's worth of food. Right? I'm looking around. Some of you didn't eat all of your food. You should eat, right? And yet the Jewish people say, no, the threshold for when we are satisfied is low. The threshold for gratitude is low. And what Kurtzer suggests, and a gift I want to leave you with today, is there is wisdom. This is a year when it is possible. It is even necessary to look at all of the terrible and horrible things that are unfolding in Gaza, that are unfolding, in Israel, the threats that Israel faces, the constant bombardment from Hezbollah, the soldiers who are dying, the people who are starving, All of that is real. All of it is real. And I will add to it the way in which the occupation of Palestinians is corroding the souls of soldiers and the souls of so many people who are living there. Those are all true. And the threshold for gratitude is low. And all of those terrible problems do not erase the miracle that Jews have a place. It is, and I will just say it this way, I am grateful to have the challenge of wrestling with what should a Jewish army do. I'm not ashamed. I am not ashamed, and I will not be ashamed that Jews defend themselves. And I don't minimize that Jews are making mistakes. Do I think that those mistakes are somehow worse than what the United States does? I don't. Do I think that they're worse than what Iran or Syria or China or any other country in the world does? I do not. I don't think that that erases them. I don't think it makes it okay. And I'm grateful to have that challenge. I told you that there's a question about should you say Hallel, right? And there are people who say, by saying Hallel, right, you're saying that it's like Hanukkah. You're saying Hanukkah was 2,000 years ago. This is, 75 years ago. What you're saying is that God was active in history, right? And you are leaving out there the possibility of a Rav Kook, right? Of a messianic approach to the state of Israel. And what I want to say is no, right? I believe that you can say Hallel and not be messianic. I believe that you can believe in Zionism without needing to say that Zionism means claiming every inch of the land of Israel. I want to celebrate compromise. I want to celebrate partial victories. I want to celebrate a low threshold, not a high threshold. And just so you see, Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said that the song in the Torah, right, crossing the Red Sea, Moses and the Jewish people recited it when they ascended from the sea. And, who says Hallel, right? The Gemara asked the question, the rabbis asked the question, who's supposed to say Hallel? By the way, Sarah, if I lose you, it's because my battery has 20%. So I think I'll make it. But if you're still there and I lose you, I apologize. And the Gemara answers, the prophets among them established it for the Jewish people that they recited on every occasion and for every trouble. In other words, it's a low standard, right, for when you say Hallel. Every occasion, and for every trouble, may it not come upon them. When they are redeemed, they recited over their redemption. Right? Any little thing, say Hallel. Right? Adam Goldstein gave a wonderful Devar Torah. He talked about say Shechianu. Right? Say blessings, be grateful, sing over the things that there are to sing in the world. Right? And finally, a beautiful teaching. Two other things. The song Dayenu, right? And if you're not familiar with the Haggadah, this may be over your head, so forgive me for a minute. Hey, when does Dayenu come in the Seder? Well, first of all, okay, now I caught you all because you're not doing the second half of the Seder, okay? There's a part of the Seder after the meal, okay? But even if you only do the first half of the Seder, it comes after the Magid, after you finish telling the story, and before you start reciting Hallel. There's a part, you recite the first little part of Hallel before the meal, okay? And right before you recite the first part of Hallel, you sing Dayenu. So Rabbi Menachem Liptag, who's a teacher at one of the yeshivot in the West Bank, explains that we all say Dayenu is like a nice idea. Dayenu means it would have been enough, right? And if you've ever been in a Seder with children, people read Dayenu, it would have been enough if you had just taken us out. Really? Right? We were going to get killed in the wilderness, right? It would have been enough if you had just fed us manna. Really? We didn't need water too, right? Like, come on, right? Actually, we needed most of these things. And what Rabbi Littag says is the way to understand Dayenu, he says is, let me just see if I can find it. Within this context, see that paragraph? Within this context, the refrain of Dayenu has an implicit suffix. In other words, Dayenu should not be translated simply as it would have been enough, but rather Dayenu, it would have been enough to praise God. It would have been enough to say Hallel if God had only split the sea, if God had only killed the Egyptians, if God had only given us manna. In other words, Hallel, it would have been enough. Any of these things is enough to say Hallel. Any of these things is enough to celebrate. Any of these things is enough to be grateful. And so, because you asked the question, I could end there, okay, but because you asked the question, I'll finish with the last little part here. What you have, it's not labeled, but where it says 416, I think it's on your last page, is the end of the laws of Purim and Hanukkah in Maimonides' code. Okay, so we've jumped forward 1,000 years from the Mishnah. Okay, got to keep track here, right? It's still just like yesterday. 1,000 years ago, it's like yesterday in Jewish tradition, right? But we've jumped forward 1,000 years. Maimonides has written a code for the Jewish people, and let me tell you about Hanukkah and Purim. And so this is the last entry in a whole thing about all the laws of Hanukkah and Purim. Okay. If a poor person must choose between Sabbath lights, between the Sabbath candles and Hanukkah candles, or between Shabbat candles and wine for Kiddush. So what I want you to notice is this is strange. It's not like logically, you have to ask yourself, why is he concluding with this particular issue, right? In the case that there's somebody who's so poor and they have to make this choice between the lighting, the candles of home take priority. So he could have stopped there, but he gives you a reason. So as to sustain peace in the home. In other words, your wife, she's not going to be very happy if you don't light Shabbat candles, because if you don't light Shabbat candles, they burn out the Hanukkah candles burn out quickly, and you're going to eat in the dark. So let go of the Hanukkah candles, light Shabbos candles. And even the divine name was erased in the oath of purgation that's referring to the Sota ceremony. Okay, the Sota ceremony, the rabbis basically said it never really worked. Okay, but the idea was you wrote God's name in and then you put it in and you dissolved it and then she had to drink this thing, right? And that was all to basically, appease a jealous husband who shouldn't be jealous, right? And it allowed the couple to stay together. Okay, approved, right? She didn't cheat on you, right? It was trying to create peace in the world. The divine name was erased to create peace between a jealous husband and his wife. Great is peace, since the entire Torah has been given to create peace in the world. As it's written, right? Darchecha darchei noam v'chol nitivoteha shalom. Right? You guys know that from Eitz Chaim. Its ways are ways of pleasantness. All its paths are peace. And about this, Noam Sion wrote. Okay, and Noam Sion wrote about what David Harpin wrote. Maimonides chooses to conclude the Book of Festivals by declaring that Shabbat candles, which stand for domestic peace, take priority over Hanukkah candles that proclaim a divine human military victory. In other words, the zealousness of Hanukkah, right? He returns to the rabbis would diminish the zealousness of Hanukkah, and Maimonides is choosing to finish a whole section of laws all about Hanukkah. And by the way, Purim, you heard last time, has a pretty bad massacre in it too. Okay, and I talked about how we have to read the Megillah differently during these times than in previous years. The virtues of peace-seeking compromise must be preferred to the uncompromising idealism of the zealot. The God of compromise who would forego his honor to encourage a husband to forego his jealous suspicions of his wife is prior to the zealous, jealous God who inspires zealous priests to execute idolatrous traitors. Just as the laws of the kings at the end of the Mishnah Torah transcends the political realm and emphasizes the opportunity for individual Torah study is the key to personal redemption, so the laws of Hanukkah and the holidays in general conclude with a defense of the family values of peace. In David, Rabbi Hartman's reading of Maimonides, the goal of the Guide to the Perplexed is also the goal of the Mishnah Torah. The private realm helps to heal the dangers of the heroic political life of the fanatic nationalists and triumphant messianists by placing them in their instrumental perspective as means to a higher end. So I'll leave it to you to sort of review all that language. The point being, celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut this year, and in doing so, celebrating an approach to Zionism that appreciates what we have and is not seeking for more and more and more of what we are not. Let's remind ourselves that it's good to give thanks, that we give thanks at any possible moment, any and every possible moment. And even as the state of Israel experiences this dark and difficult time, there still is something to celebrate. Thank you. Sarah, I don't know if you're there, but I'm going to close out the meeting. So take care. Oh, she gave out love. You too. Be well.